Hello, everybody, and welcome to lesson 2 in this Chess Beginner to Winner series, in which I try to help you take the guesswork out of what to study in chess. And we started yesterday's first lesson with how to set up the board and how to move the pieces. So today we'll continue with basically how to castle and move en passant. So if you're unfamiliar with that, or never heard of it, I'll show you how both of those special moves in chess work. And let's take a look here. So yesterday we showed you how the pieces are set up, how they move. So we'll go through a possible chess game, so I can show you how to castle and move en passant. And also we could cover the move where pawns, when they make it to the other side of the board, they can be promoted to any piece that you want, except for the king, and they cannot stay a pawn. So they can promote usually to a queen, because that's one of the most valuable pieces. It's the most valuable piece other than the king, because if you lose the king, you lose the game. So most often when a pawn gets to the other side, it's promoted to a queen, but you could promote it to any of the other pieces, the rook, knight, or bishop. Okay, so if we start out with a game, usually e4 is a good opening move, and then the opponent could respond with e5. So we move our pawn to this e4 square, where it's controlling the center, and it gives room for your bishop and queen to move later in the game. So in chess, generally you want to develop your pieces. So let's say the knight moves here, another knight moves here, and now I don't know, let's say another pawn moves forward. And on both sides, you end up developing and capturing pieces. And so let's say some captures happen here. And the game just continues in this manner. So we just keep developing until the pieces on the back row start becoming developed. And now, in order to castle, you have to make sure that there are no spaces in between your king and your rook like this. So let's say if we just keep developing all the pieces, I don't know, maybe this goes here. This piece is developed here. Maybe the queen goes here, queen here, and I don't know, the other pieces developed. Anyway, this is an example of how the pieces could be moved. Now we notice that both sides have room on the queen side and the king side of the board for the castle and the king to perform what is called castling. So basically, the rules for castling are that you must clear out the pieces in between the king and the rook. So, and it can be either side. So once the pieces have been developed and moved out from in between the king and either rook, to perform the castling maneuver, you must move the king 2 squares to the left or the right. So first you move the king. If we wanted to castle king side, we move over 2, and then you jump the rook on the other side. So this is an unusual move, and that is the only time that the king can move 2 squares. And it's also the only time that the rook can jump over a piece. So this would be king side castling. If black decides to castle queenside, he could do that like this, although he probably wouldn't do that because it's a little open over here on the queen side. But as an example, the king would move first 2 squares and the rook would jump on the other side. Now, I'll go here, or I'll set up a different position and show you more of these rules on castling. So if we set up this position from scratch, we'll clear the board. So let's say the king is in the center here and the rook is here, and the white king wants to castle to the queen side here, or excuse me, to the king side of the board. If he would want to castle here, he could do that as well. Now, the rules for castling are that the king must not have moved in the game as well. So first you have to clear the pieces out from in between the king and the castle from their starting positions. And you cannot have already moved the king or the castle that you want to castle on that side to. So if this king, if this king had already moved to here and then moved back, now he can no longer castle on either side of the board. But if the king had not moved, and let's say the rook had moved, and then moved back, well, he can no longer castle on the king side because he moved that rook. But if the king or the rook have not moved on the queen side, well, then he could move over 2 and jump on the other side and perform the castling move. And another thing to be cognizant of and make sure that you follow is the rule that if your opponent puts you in check, so let's say there's a bishop and it moves down the board and puts you in check. Well, now you can no longer castle out of check immediately, so you can't perform this castling move. So just remember, if your king is in check, you cannot castle to escape check. But let's say, I don't know, white had another piece. So let's say he had a bishop that he could block with like this. And let's say now this bishop just retreated. Well, now white could go ahead and castle, even though he was in check, as long as he didn't move his king. Then if he is no longer in check, he can go ahead and castle. So another thing to watch out for, knowing that when you're in check, you cannot castle. Now, I'll explain another rule. You cannot castle through a square that is under attack. So let's say there was a rook lined up here, aimed down the board. Well, now white can no longer castle on the queen side because he would be traveling through a square that's under attack. And if the rook was, also if the rook was over here, the king cannot also castle by moving on to this square over here that is under attack. So just watch out for checks when you're trying to castle. You can't castle if you're in check. You can't escape by castling, and you cannot you also cannot castle onto a square that's under attack or cross through a square that's under attack. So just remember that. Now, one other thing. Let's see here. I keep moving the wrong piece. All right. So one other thing to remember. Now let's say the rook is attacking here, here you can still castle. You can move the king over 2, and the rook can cross over this square that's being attacked. That makes no difference. Just as long as the king doesn't move through a square that's being attacked, and if the king itself is in check, which means that the king is just being attacked, the king cannot escape by castling. Just as a review, when it comes to castling, first, in order to castle, you want to clear out the space, clear out the pieces between the king and your rook. Once that is done, you also have to make sure that you have not already moved the king, so the king cannot move to a square and then move back. Then he can no longer castle. So make sure the pieces are moved out from in between the king and the rook. Make sure you have not moved the king or the rook yet, and then you may go ahead and castle, as long as the king is also not being attacked. So once he's under attack, you cannot castle unless you block that attack. So let's say a knight, moves from somewhere, blocks the attack. Well, now the king can go ahead and castle. But if the rook is covering a square that the king would have to travel through, then he cannot castle on that side. He may be able to castle on the other side. All right, so once again, clear out the pieces between the king and the rook. Make sure that the king is not in check, and make sure that the squares that the king will travel across are not being attacked. So then, after that, you will be able to castle. So here, white cannot castle king side, but he can castle to the queen side. And remember to always move the king 2 squares, whether he travels to the queen side or the king side of the board. If he goes in this direction, if we get rid of this rook. So now, always 2, and it's easiest to just move your king first 2 squares, then grab the rook and place it on the other side. So if we go to the queen side, it would be the king once again moving 2 squares first, and the rook jumps on the other side, just like that. And so same thing for the king side. We can go ahead and show, or for the black side of the board. So let's say, excuse me, bear with me while I sort these pieces out. So let's say nobody's castled yet, then it's black's turn to move. He could go ahead and castle king side or queen side here. So king side over 2, and the castle jumps to the other side. And then if he decides to castle queen side, once again, over 2, and the rook goes immediately to the other side of the king. So there you have it. That should help you to be able to castle in your own games. And now we'll move on to the en passant move, which this is kind of a tricky move, and a lot of people never even hear about this move when they're playing chess. I've come across people that have been playing chess for a long time, and they never even heard of this move. So en passant is French for in passing, and the rule for en passant is basically, let's see here. At the start of a game, when all your pieces are set up, the pawns are on the second row for each side here. Now, the pawns can move 1 or 2 squares on their first move. So, white, let's say he moves 2 squares out, and then black decides to just move 1. And then white moves another pawn 2, and black decides to move his pawn to. And then white, instead of capturing here, just pushes forward like this. Well, now, if black jumped out 2 squares on his first move, white would have the option to perform an en passant capture, which is basically capturing this black pawn the same as if it only moved 1 square. So white would just move here and capture that pawn. So that's probably tricky to you because you were told that the pawns can only capture pieces that are diagonally 1 square in front of them. So here, if we go back and look at that, it looks kind of crazy that this pawn would just jump here and capture this pawn now that was behind it. And so it would be the same as if this pawn only moved 1 square and you just captured it. Well, instead, we see the pawn move 2 squares and you still are able to capture it. Now, there are special rules for this en passant move that make it a little tricky. So, in this position, it's black's turn to move, and he jumps out 2. So that's the only time that you can perform an en passant capture, is if you have pushed your pawn up to the 5th rank, and your opponent jumps out 2 squares on his first move, and then you capture. So, we could not have a move here by black, and then white does some other random move, and then the pawn moves up to the second, moves up here beside the pawn. So like this, let's say white does this, and then black goes here, and it took him 2 moves to get here. En passant is no longer an option for white. So, if we go back, once white has a pawn up here on the 5th rank and black immediately jumps out 2, now this is the only time that white could try and capture this pawn with en passant, is to immediately move here to f6 and capture that pawn. And white must do it immediately, then and there. Also, he is not allowed to wait, make another move, and then capture that pawn. It must be done as soon as that pawn jumps out 2 squares on the first move of that pawn, landing beside one of your pawns. So I'll set up the position and show you some other examples. All right, so let's say there's a pawn here and white has a pawn here or here. Well, now, if the black pawn jumps out 2 squares forward on its first move, either one of these pawns can capture en passant. So either this pawn moves here and captures, or, oh, excuse me, I made a mistake there. Or once the pawn jumps out 2, the other pawn can capture. So either one of these pawns can jump and capture. The same, I apologize for these pieces. They're not cooperating. All right. So all you have to remember is that whenever a pawn can jump out 2 squares on its first move and it lands beside an opponent's pawn, the opponent has the option to capture it en passant. So once again, if he jumps out 2, this pawn can capture en passant. Also, if black has jumped, or excuse me, if black has made it to his 5th rank, so we'll set the pieces up here. It's the same thing. So let's say, I don't know, we'll do something crazy. Let's say that goes there, and then white, I don't know, just plays some move on the side of the board, and this pawn just pushes forward. Well, now, if either this F pawn jumps up 2 and lands here, or the D pawn jumps up 2 and lands here, either one could be captured by this black pawn using the en passant rule. So if this is played, en passant is possible, capturing. All right, so if this pawn is played, en passant would capture the pawn. All right, so just remember, and we'll set the board back up to the beginning here. All right, so that is pretty much what you have to remember for en passant. It involves a pawn moving 2 spaces forward on its first move. So if I clear everything off the board and just get back to the basics here. So whenever your opponent has a pawn that has been pushed up far enough where you make your first pawn move, not of the game, but anytime one of your pawns is about to make its first move. Here, I'll put another pawn on the board. All right, so if it's this H pawn's first move and the pawn jumps up 2, well, black would be able to capture it by moving here, the same as if this pawn would have just moved 1 square and he captures it. With en passant, that same pawn can move 2 and you can still capture it. But remember that you must do it immediately as soon as that pawn has jumped out. So if we have that same pawn jumping forward and black doesn't perform en passant, well, then it's too late and that pawn can just continue marching up the board. And now, why did this rule come about? Well, when chess was first being developed, hundreds of years ago, centuries ago, it was a little bit of a slower game. And so they wanted to kind of speed chess up. In the past, I believe pawns only moved 1 square at a time. And they thought, well, let's speed the game up. We'll let the pawns move 1 or 2 squares on their first move. Well, then somebody said, well, okay, what if somebody already has a pawn up here on the 5th rank and they jump 2 now and they'll just jump right past me and keep on going? Well, that's why the en passant move came about, because now you can move here and capture it the same as if that pawn only moved 1 square forward. And just remember, you have to capture en passant immediately as soon as your opponent jumps out 2 squares. And so that's pretty much it. So hopefully between yesterday's lesson, which taught you how to set up the board and how all the pieces move, and today's lesson where we taught you about castling and the en passant move, and also one other thing about pawns. If the pawns make it all the way up the board to the end here, well, then they can be promoted to a queen, usually, because that queen is such a powerful piece. But also you could promote it to the rook, the knight, or the bishop. Now, you can never promote it to a king. You're not allowed to have more than 1 king on the board. But if all 8 of your pawns made it to the other side of the board and you already had your original queen, you could possibly have 9 queens on the board. So it doesn't matter if you have multiples of a piece. It just matters that you bring that pawn all the way from your side of the board to your opponent's side. And the reward for reaching the end is that you get to promote it to your choice of queen, rook, knight, or bishop. And it cannot remain a pawn, and it cannot be promoted to a king, because only one king is allowed on each side of the board. All right, well, I hope you learned a little bit with this lesson, enough here in lesson 2 to be able to play a game of chess. Stay tuned for lesson 3, and I will go over how to checkmate, and also what a stalemate is. A lot of people have trouble figuring out what checkmate and stalemate are. So lesson number 3, stay tuned. We'll go over checkmate and stalemate. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, please go ahead and do that and support the channel. And also feel free to leave comments or suggestions or any video requests on something you would like to learn about or like me to do a video on. So thank you, everyone, and have a great chess day.